Hey guys, K-Train. I have something I've needed to address for a while here, and I don't want to put it off any longer. Here, you can see grease is coming out of the CV boot and getting slung around. So I'm going to show you how to change the axle on the left side, the driver's side of 2005 Impala. This procedure is pretty much identical for 2000 to 2005 Monte Carlos and Impalas. I'm going to show you how we remove the axle from the wheel bearing insert, and then if we just disconnect strut tower here, you can get the wheel bearing out of the way, and then with this side free, with the outside of the axle free, pull it free of the transmission. There's this snap ring that holds it in there. If you need to replace a CV joint axle or a wheel bearing, this video should help you. We're going to do axle, wheel bearing, and transmission axle seal. Unless you have a reason to, or you believe that the wheel bearing is damaged or doesn't spin evenly, you can replace just the axle. The components are designed for that. So to take this apart, we have a 33mm deep socket that we put in the wheel bearing hub to loosen the outside axle nut. With the outside axle nut off the wheel bearing, you can leave the nut on the end, just thread it on just enough, and then you can hit this with a hammer so you won't mushroom the axle like if you're returning it for core or anything. But another thing you can do is this wheel hub puller. It goes on the studs of the hub, and then you can use it to push it off the axle. That's pretty nice, so you can evenly push it off, and you're not hitting it. You don't have to hit anything with a hammer. If you hit this with a hammer without the nut on there, you're going to mushroom this. From there, once we get the other wheel hub pieces out of the way, like take off the brake caliper, and then take out the 3 bolts that holds the wheel hub, and then we can slide the wheel hub off. Then we'll have an axle laying in there. A lot of times you can just pull them out and the retainer, the snap ring on the outside of the axle, will just let go. If you're pulling it and it won't move, you could turn it a little bit and then pull it out. But another good thing to do, which is what I'm going to do today, is This slide hammer, we can go like this to initially knock that axle free. You should be able to get behind the joint, and then you can just knock it so it's free, and then you'll just be able to pull it out with your hands. It's important to note when you do that, you're going to lose some transmission fluid where this axle was inserted, so you should have a catch pan there. When inserting a new axle seal, especially on 4T65 on the driver's side, on the left-hand side of the car, if you're sitting in it, the axle is going to be sticking out. So you need an axle seal installer, something like this. There's several options, so that you can evenly push the seal on and it stays seated on the ring, so then it's in there straight and doesn't deform. But then the axle has somewhere, the male axle connector has somewhere to, the splines have somewhere to go. A similar seal installer is like this. This is aluminum. Again, there's a cavity for stuff to go. When we're taking this apart, we're going to need 13, 15, 18 millimeter sockets and a deep 21 millimeter socket to take the bottom of the strut tower out to get enough room to get the new axle in there. First thing we need to do is get the axle nut loose. The torque spec is 160 Newton meters, so it needs a lot of force to remove. So, got this deep 33 millimeter socket and a pretty big helper bar. I've lowered the vehicle and I've loaded the tire with the weight of the vehicle, so all this will stay in place as we do this. Now we can take the other stuff off, get this out of there. Remove the caliper from the caliper bracket, get it out of the way. With the caliper bracket removed, you can take the rotor off, and now we have access to the wheel bearing. The triangle shaped bracket, there's 3 bolts that come in from the back side of the knuckle here. We run those bolts out, we could take the wheel hub off. Once you get the 21mm nut off these bolts, because this was loaded, the bolts not just want to come out. It's going to be pretty tight. So speed it out of there with something, and then this will be loose and we can work with it. Now with these bolts free, I can push the axle back out of the hub. The hub's turning. The axle can't stop it anymore. So we're free of it. I can't quite get the clearance to get the axle out. So I'm going to disconnect the lower ball joint. And that will give me a lot more freedom of movement for this steering knuckle, and axle should come out no problem. There's a cotter pin on the ball joint nut, and then we should be able to separate this. Once this is separated, if you turn the wheel to the right so the hub is perpendicular, that will give you more room so you can get the axle, you can bend the axle joint and pull it out of the hub. Because if all you're doing is replacing the axle, don't want to have to take the ball joint or the hub out if you don't have to. So that gave me enough room to pull that out. Since I am doing the wheel bearing, take these 3 bolts out of the backhand side, 13mm bolts. And wheel speed sensor plug, a little plastic rivet that holds it on this bracket. We want to separate that before we try to pull this out, because it's going to come out with this. All right, a lot of rust buildup, but this side's free now. If I could do the same down here, I think it's should just fall out. All right, this gave me the leverage I needed. So if you saw, I wiggle this back and forth, and I got an angle of leverage to pull it out. So I have a catch pan down there. I should be able to just pull the axle out, but I want to pull it out nicely. I'm going to get this out of my way. Okay, ATF is leaking out. I'm trying to pull this out just enough so that it's free, because I want to inspect the axle seal that's there, because I believe it was leaking. His boot seal was compromised. The other axle makes a ton of noise. This one, not as bad. On the left, on the driver's side, the axle is female. Let's go compare these. These are very close. Clearly different manufacturer. This is a little bit longer because of the way I pulled this out. But all the sections are the same length. So I think this is going to go in just fine. Let's check that seal and we'll get this back in there. This is the left, the driver's side axle seal. This is red. The ACDelco replacement I have is blue. I'm not sure if that makes a difference, but I do know the passenger side, the replacement is green because they re-engineered it. To get this out of there, I beat a small pry bar behind the lip, and then once it was a little bit free, then it just fell off. I took as much care as I could not to get any debris in the transmission and to not knock the axle shaft getting this out. Let's compare it to the other one. Definitely a different manufacturer, but all the stuff that matters is the same. This is what the axle shaft opening looks like without the axle seal in there. This ring is what holds it in. So I'm going to wipe this up. I'm going to put ATF on the seal, so we don't want to mix other oils and grease with the transmission fluid. It'll change its properties and probably clog transmission filter. So I'll wipe this clean, and then after I wipe it clean, I'll get another rag and absorb some ATF and make sure it's all over the seal that I insert in. Before I put this new axle seal in, I'm going to put some transmission fluid on here. We don't want to mix any other lubes with the ATF, so this is the funnel I usually use for ATF. Okay, it started coming out. This way I can control the flow, but still get it on everything. Okay, let's get this in there. This new seal goes here. And then we'll seat the tool on there and tap it in. We want to hit it just hard enough to beat it in there. Don't want to hit it harder than we have to. I think I bottomed out. No. I got the top in. This part's still wide. That might be it. I felt it straighten out. It's just a little bit of a gap. I should see if it'll seat just a little bit further. I think I just felt that, yeah. Yeah. Okay, now we're going to reseat this axle. Because I left the wheel knuckle in place, I don't have enough room to dip up. So I'm going to turn the wheel to the left again, so then the axle can come forward into the wheel knuckle, and then I'll be able to push this straight on, and then I can push this in. With the wheel turned to the left, I was able to push the axle in. When you're checking if you're seated, there should be just about no gap, and then at least with your hand you should not be able to pull the axle out of the output shaft. Don't pull it by the axle. You may extend a boot too far or mess up the joint. So we know this is in there good. I know I felt it slip past the lock ring. So I know this is in here. Since I have the axles inserted in the transmission, needed to separate the steering knuckle from the ball joint so I can get it to come over the axle. You're definitely going to need to do this if you aren't changing the wheel bearing, because you won't have nearly as much play. That should do it. I'm going to get the ball joint reattached. And then we'll reattach the strut. And then I'm going to put this wheel bearing back, the new wheel bearing on. Now it's time to put the new wheel hub on. I've already reconnected the lower ball joint on the steering knuckle, reinstalled the castle nut and the cotter pin. I might show you guys the ball joint by itself in a different video. The axle output spindle is here. So now we can put the new 5-stud hub on. This includes the wheel speed sensor. These W-body Impala and Monte Carlo, they have tire pressure sensors as a result of wheel spin sensing. So you're going to get tire pressure warning if you don't have the wheel speed sensor. Some manufacturer replacements don't come with the wheel speed sensor, but this is all one piece, and a lot of people say they get better results after installing these if their wheel bearings go. So to install this, I'm going to ensure longevity. I'm going to put some gear oil on the spline, just a little bit, not a dripping amount, and then place this on. And then I'm not going to tighten the wheel hub nut the whole way until we have it on the ground. But we'll tighten it snug, and we won't torque until we have it on the ground. One good way to control oil distribution is with an industrial syringe. I'm going to use this industrial syringe to apply some gear oil to the spindle splines. This is not necessary, but it helps to protect it. Something I just have a habit of doing. Here I have a controlled application. I just did one line of gear oil on here. I'm just going to do it every couple, and then I'm going to wipe off the excess. If you recall, this bracket protects the ball joint down here and has a mount for this clip for wheel speed sensor. So if you've had it apart for a while, or if you're new to the party, the bracket goes on like this way. We don't want to forget it. The wheel speed sensor wire dips through and then comes out the back to be plugged in. So we're lined up. It looks like we're in pretty good shape. Something that is pretty important here is GM, OEM manufacturer, they have explicit bulletins that say if you have to loosen or remove the wheel bearing assembly from the steering knuckle, that you should discard the wheel bearing bolts and get new ones. They state that failure is possible if you reuse these bolts. You think about it, the bolt fails, and then once that bolt fails, the only thing holding it on is the axle nut on the hub. And as soon as that becomes loose, this is going to start to spin irregular. So if you're watching this video just for the wheel hub, the manufacturer says you should use new wheel hub bolts to mount it. So we're pretty close already. Make sure you know you're threaded in all three locations before you start tightening, because you're not supposed to reuse the bolts, so you want to get it right first try. There wasn't much clearance at the top of the axle. I actually backed the axle off so I could get the bolt past, so then I know that I'm starting to thread. Okay, these are all fundamentally tight. So the angles, I have this 16-degree socket extension. Makes it easier to get in there with the angles with the 13mm to tighten these down. Now that all 3 bolts are snug, I'm going to bring them to 80 Newton meters, and then the OEM spec 130 Newton meters. Okay, we got all 3 bolts to 130 Newton meters. The hub's in place. We have the axle in the hub ready to go. So we'll get this wheel bearing nut on the end of the axle, and then put the brake back on, and we can lower the car and tighten this. Remember, since we unattached the strut and the ball joint, you're going to need an alignment. So either do that or go get an alignment once you have this all back together and you've driven around the block and it's okay. Alright, so we got the caliper bracket and the caliper back on. Got new rotors and pads. So now we can put the wheel on, set this on the ground, and torque the axle nut. Alright, so we're going to let this down, and we're going to tighten this to 160 Newton meters. There we go. New axle, new wheel bearing. Now we're on the driver's side. I've already loosened the axle nut by having the car on the ground. There's a couple different options, but this guy we'll put on here, and then we can use to free the axle bearing from the axle on this side. So we'll just get a few lug nuts to hold this on. And then we can do the center. Yeah, this is free. So now I'll use this ball joint separation tool to separate the ball joint from the wheel knuckle. And once that's loose and we remove the bolts holding the strut, the wheel knuckle will come this way without having to remove the tie rod. And then there'll be enough joint where I can pull the CV joint out of the wheel bearing so we can put the new one in. To remove the axle from the wheel bearing, you're supposed to remove the strut and the ball joint from the steering knuckle. So now with the axle out of the way, I'm going to separate the ball joint and the wheel knuckle can go to the side so that I can put the new CV joint in there. Okay, so we have the right side CV joint out. So now what I'm going to do, which you should only do this if you need to, is to replace the red axle seal that you see and then insert the new axle in there. These are some of the best tools for pulling seals because you can get on the lip and you can start to get it to pull out without deforming the seal too much. Let's see how this goes. I was able to get out real easy with the narrower side of this pick. And just pull this way. And I got leverage and I only touched the seal. I didn't nick any of this. Alright, here's the new seal and the insertion tool. It's definitely important on the right side to get it right because it has the cone to make sure you keep a seal, and this has a space for it to lay so it doesn't get smashed if you just use a hammer or if you use a very thick socket or anything like that. So I made sure I got this a little bit wet with some ATF. Let's get it back in there. Okay, I got this seal installer rod. I beat this in there. So what we should feel is the seal is the same the whole way around, and nothing got deformed while installing it. Nope. Okay, now we can insert the new axle. Okay, I've pushed the new axle in. You usually have to wiggle it back and forth to figure out so the splines line up and so the snap ring slides in. Once it's in there, it goes in. Should be very little gap between the back side of the CV and the transmission. And now it'll move just a little bit in and out, but now you know the snap ring is holding it in. Okay, I've brought the steering knuckle back to here and I've put it on the bottom ball joint and put the end of the CV output shaft through it. You would do the same thing if you had the wheel, if you left the wheel bearing attached to the steering knuckle, which you should. Unless you're changing it, don't take it off, because The bolts are one-time use bolts. So you would just turn the CV joint here to slide it into the wheel bearing, and then attach the castle nut for the ball joint, and put the strut back on, put the brakes back on. Since we're doing wheel bearing as well, I took it off because it's easier. But you can get the angles, you can bend this joint so you can push it into the wheel bearing without having to take this off. If you do take it off by mistake or anything like that, get new bolts to attach the wheel bearing to the steering knuckle, or they may come loose. Okay, I've run in the strut bolts, and the CV axle is laying in the bearing. But I don't have the nut on, I don't have these tightened yet. I want to be sure that I have this lined up. The splines of the wheel bearing are matching with the CV. So I'm going to turn each of these 3 bolts, tightening them a little bit at a time. That will pull this most of the way onto the CV joint, and then installing the nut will do the rest. Like the other side, I'll put this nut on here at least past the face of the end of the output shaft, but when I load it up and tighten it, I want to have the wheel on the ground. So let's get that tightened. Okay, the wheel bearing is torqued down. The strut bolts are torqued down. We have a new brake rotor and pads. Have the caliper back on. I've run the nut as tight as I can just with my finger. So now put the car down, tighten this to 130 Newton meters. See how the steering is. The steering should still be close to good because I didn't take off the tie rod ends, but stuff got moved around. We'll see. So I'm going to tighten this axle nut. I'm going to check the transmission fluid. I'm going to put it to where it needs to be, and then I'm going to run the car until it gets warm. Then I'm going to make sure the transmission fluid is still at the correct level. Once I've done that, I'm going to take it for a test drive. I hope this helps you do any CV joints or wheel bearing stuff that you need to do on your Monte Carlo or Impala.